good morning. Welcome everybody to Change Festival and to this conversation, which is called Rise Up to Reclaim. I am your host for this session, and my name is Amisha Ghadiali, and I'm the host of a podcast called The Future is Beautiful, which is about to be renamed The Futures, as well as a facilitator and an author and a yogi and human in different ways. And so this particular conversation, we're exploring reclaiming. Who owns the land? Who owns the rivers? Who owns the rocks? Humans have long laid claims to the parts of the natural world that they can physically hoard, leading to wars, colonization, and capitalism. This has also resulted in us now living in the greatest time of inequality that civilization has ever encountered. Many studies have shown that we have enough resources to share equally between all humans, giving everyone a good standard of living. But how do we achieve that? How do we reclaim power and resources from the hands of the few to distribute to all human and non-human creatures? How do we radically reinvent the concept of ownership within our homes, our workplaces, our communities and landscapes to ensure that every living being has equal access to all the incredible wonders that Earth has to offer? And so I'd like to welcome this incredible panel of speakers that we have today. So starting from my right, we have Paul Turner. Welcome, Paul. Paul is a radical geographer and teacher, as well as social and environmental activist. Paul helped set up the Radical School Geography Group and Teachers for Climate Action, who organize online events to bring together educators and encourage them to engage their students more critically with the world around them. Paul has authored a number of free teaching resources, including Climate Breakdown, a series of 14 lessons which explores the science and broader social questions around the climate and nature emergency. Paul is the education lead for the Ministry of Eco-Education, which is helping to place sustainability at the heart of every school in the country. And we next have Indra Adnan. Welcome, Indra. And she is the founder and co-initiator of the Alternative UK, political platform which publishes the Daily Alternative, convenes new system actors, and builds Cosmo-local community agency networks. Indra is concurrently a psychosocial therapist, journalist, and author. Through her work on international relations and soft power, she has consulted to the World Economic Forum, Indian and Danish governments, NATO, the Scottish Executive, and the Institute of Contemporary Arts, amongst others. She is co-lead in the social enterprise network, Bounce Beyond, working to cohere the next global economies. Her book, The Politics of Waking Up, Power and Possibility in the Fractal Age, was published by Perspectiva Press in June of this year. And we have Anita Okunde. Welcome, Anita. Anita is a 17-year-old award-winning activist and public speaker focusing on issues specifically surrounding intersectional climate justice and feminism. Anita's work has a focus of putting those disproportionately affected by the crisis we face at the forefront of the movement. This work has led to her being listed as one of the top 100 environmental activists by Forbes. Thank you, Anita. And finally, we have Sam Lee. Sam is a Mercury Prize nominated folk singer, author, conservationist, song collector, award-winning promoter, broadcaster, and activist. Alongside his organisation, the Nest Collective, he plays a unique role in the British music scene, shaking up boundaries between folk and contemporary music and the assumed places and ways folk song is appreciated, including through his latest critically acclaimed album, Old Wow. Sam's debut book, The Nightingale, Notes on a Songbird, tells the epic tale of this highly endangered bird and their place in culture folklore, folk song, music, and literature throughout the millennia. So we have an incredible group of people here to explore this theme of reclaiming. And so before we begin, I'd just like to invite us just to take a moment together. And if you'd like to place your feet more firmly on the ground, and maybe you want to close your eyes or keep them open. And be aware of the skies above us, the clouds, perhaps the sun. And just take a few breaths, noticing how it feels to be here on this planet Earth today. And noticing what feels alive within you around this theme of reclaiming. And we are gathered here at Change Festival, right in the middle of COP26 in Glasgow, where many world leaders and activists from all over the world are gathered around this very theme of reclaiming. And you're ready, you can open your eyes if they're closed and come back in this space. Paul, I'm going to ask you if you can share a time where you have reclaimed something in your life or in your work.
So I think being a teacher, we all as teachers go through training, and it's very sort of instructive in the process of how you should teach. And I think something that has been a bit of an awakening for me is realizing that actually, as a teacher and an educator, there's the opportunity to reclaim the process of teaching. And part of that has been thinking about what we teach. And so looking at actual issues, global issues, and thinking actually they need to have more prominence within the school curriculum, and realising, having taught the national curriculum, that so much is missing from that story, and that actually a lot of what is taught to young people is not necessarily appropriate, or doesn't provide them with or equip them with what they need in order to sort of fully engage with the world around them. So this idea of looking at things like climate breakdown and providing a more nuanced approach to actually exploring some of those big, broader societal issues that often are sort of marginalised within school environments, and thinking young people maybe shouldn't explore them at such a young age. So that's been a real opportunity to reclaim that space, and then I guess building a community around that as well. So bringing other teachers along and making them realise the opportunities that are available, and that it is within their own grasp to be able to do that. And I think also moving beyond the what, it's also the how teachers teach. There's lots of really prescriptive approaches of how teachers should operate within a classroom and the structures within a school environment. And I think so many of the problems that we experience in the world, actually there's an opportunity to unlock those and to explore them differently by arranging a classroom in a different sense. Even just being more open to the idea of taking students outside more frequently. I always talk about this sort of idea that actually it's really obvious within a school environment, the idea that we've created this indoor lifestyle where we've disconnected ourselves from the rest of nature, and young people are expected to sit at a desk and be particularly disciplined for such a long extent of the day, and it's just completely unnatural. And so lots of educators now are realising that it's quite a radical process to actually realise that and start to change and shift and do things differently, but actually the benefits of doing that and how the opportunities that are available. And I think maybe I'll just finish by coming back as well to the teaching resources that have really unlocked a lot of this as well are this Who Owns England as well. So using these ideas of land ownership and access rights, partly because this is knowledge that is actually, it's almost hidden to a certain extent. And more broadly in society, people don't realise how limited our access rights are, and how few people own the land in England. And so bringing that into the classroom and getting young people to explore that, because also one of the big problems with what young people are told is it's often a very fixed narrative, and so they leave school thinking the world operates in a certain way. And there's so much opportunity through these teaching resources in particular to expose young people to alternative ideas, to challenge that sort of narrative, and explore that sort of opportunity to open up young people's imaginations. Because I think hopefully this is a thread that will come out as well in through this discussion, is that so much of this is about having a particularly narrow opportunities to imagine the world. And school is such a good place to begin that, to almost formally train young people in the ability to be able to reimagine the world around them. And they need to be encouraged and actively seek opportunities to explore that. So with this series of teaching resources, one of the lessons challenges students to, when they go home, to go for a walk and see how quickly they come across their nearest boundary, the sort of private no access sign, and to take a photo next to that and then bring it to the next lesson and sort of then explore that relationship between how much land can they actually access within their own environment and near them. And that's just a taster of some of those sort of experiential opportunities that you can encourage young people to do.
Can you share a little bit deeper about what radical geography is?
So, radical geography has existed for decades, and it's existed at the university level, and it's something that academics are very comfortable with approaching, and it brings sort of Marxist, feminist ideas from the left. But within the school context, people are particularly fearful of bringing those sorts of ideas into the school environment because they perceive it to be political, or there's this sense of fear around those sorts of ideas, and there's a very strict pathway of what is perceived to be safe. And so what we're trying to say though is actually, rather than being prescriptive and saying, yeah, you need to teach this, let's explore developing critical faculties. So instead of just delivering information and saying you need to learn this in order to then achieve a grade in an exam, that's, once you leave school, that's not the reality. We all know that whilst you're at school, you think that you're defined by some sort of grade, but as soon as you leave school, as soon as you then go into what people might term the real world, you can be much more than that. And so actually we can pull that into the school classroom. We can say that let's be driven, let's drive education by that idea rather than by this prescriptive nature of grades and exams and terminal assessment. And within the geography kind of subject, that then opens up so many opportunities to explore the world, to think more differently, and to be really critical and questioning of the world around us, to then explore alternatives.
Thank you. Anita, this whole sort of set us up with what's possible for young people. Can you share from your perspective what you've been able to reclaim?
I personally think, personally in my life, I'd probably start off with looking at how my relationship with climate justice came about. I think that was a big part of me reclaiming that type of space. I think beforehand, I was very skeptical about the climate movement in the space. It was very white dominated. And I think a lot of young people, people of colour, kind of look at the climate space in that way, and they think, why would I get involved when I don't see anyone like me in the climate movement? And I think that was the biggest type of hurdle in kind of getting into the climate movement or starting my work, because I had to kind of see whether I felt comfortable there or whether this was a space for me. And for a long time, I thought it wasn't. And this is really important to me. When I did get into the space, I made a lot of amazing friends and a lot of new people who did look like me. And I realized that it's not that there's no one that looks like me there. It's just that they aren't as broadcasted. And I think that's why that's a big goal of mine, to make sure that other people of color, young people specifically, actually have those people they can look to and those role models, and they see that it's not this white-dominated, scary space that it sometimes looks like on the TV and the media, and that it's for everyone, and it's really inclusive and accessible, which is why I work with Fridays for Future Digital to ensure that there are kind of digital resources for young people to learn about the climate crisis how it pertains to them and how it affects them specifically. And I specifically look at making sure the voices of people of colour and Indigenous people are amplified, specifically young people, because we don't actually hear them as much as we might hear like Greta Thunberg, etc. So I think it's really important that we kind of have those spaces and create those safe spaces for people of colour to ensure that they can enter the climate movement in like their own way. And I think this kind of started off with kind of my journey into like accepting my blackness. I think before, it's a big thing to do with my hair. So I really had straight hair, like really relaxed, real straight hair for ages, at least 11 years. And getting into this journey of kind of reclaiming what beauty meant to me and how I found myself useful in terms of my hair really kind of set me off on my climate journey, because I was very skeptical of it beforehand. And I was like, do I really want to go into this? The minute I chopped my hair off, everything changed. I was like, okay, I can do this now. I'm like, I've reclaimed my hair. I can get into this space and reclaim it. I can do it all. And I think a lot of young people have these personal journeys that they've been through of reclaiming something they think small in their life. But it really kind of triggers everything else, and they can go ahead and do it. I think if school gave them the platform to do that, it's really important. Because at least when I was in secondary school, I mean, it wasn't that long ago, but there was 2 pages in our chemistry textbook on the climate crisis, and that was that. You'd be lucky if you got a question on it. And I think because of how it's taught just for GCSEs or just for the exam, we don't actually learn about the climate crisis. And I think if we had a bigger emphasis of having it in schools, making sure that schools actually taught young people about the climate crisis, the ins and outs, they would actually feel a lot more empowered to actually go ahead and change the world.
Thank you, Anita. And I also want to acknowledge that as soon as you started speaking, the sound went a little bit strange, and then landed just in time for you to your real reclamation. It's really powerful what you share about your personal journey and how that reclaiming of your own identity allowed you to move deeper into this bigger work on the planet. And I got involved in climate activism maybe 15 years ago, and got very used to being one of the only people of colour in the room. And I think what's been really interesting is in this kind of reframe from sustainability to climate justice that's happened in the last year or so, that and this understanding of who's actually at the front line of the climate crisis that we're in and who's going to be affected the most and the most dramatically. It's also really opened up a bigger space, because more people of colour have been coming in and adding their voice. So thank you for being part of that. And can you share a little bit more about who you've met and who you've been inspired by in this process of reclaiming?
So yeah, I think one of the first projects I did with Fridays for Future Digital when I just started, like during lockdown, it was a press conference with Indigenous youth. So we had to find all these Indigenous youth. They was like, okay, you can run it because you were like really passionate about this at this meeting. I was like, yeah. So I was tasked with finding all these amazing young people and speaking to them to see if they'd want to do this panel. And while speaking to them and like letting them know what it was about and like hearing them talk, I realized just how much their stories inspired me. I think it's one thing to be a person of color in a Western country and like kind of hearing about it and speaking about it, but hearing it directly from the mouths of the people that live in those countries that are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis, it's a whole nother level. And how they still have that momentum, keep going, are really ready to advocate for the planet and still do that work to protect the planet. It really inspired me, and it kind of, doing that press conference and hearing them speak and having all these, like, being able to give them this platform to speak and having these journalists ask them questions, I really thought, well, this is like what I want to do. Seeing them being able to like speak in this manner and like have their voice really empowered, this is what I want to do, and this is how I feel inspired by other young people. I know other young people to be inspired by them, so yeah.
Amazing, thank you, Anita. And that takes us to you, Indra, and Reclaiming Agency. Can you tell us more about your story and how you have been reclaiming?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to hear, the sort of back and forth of, where did it start and what are you doing now? Because I think it went the opposite way round for me, which is that I found myself all my life working in this area of reclaiming agency, but really specifically reclaiming democracy. So I'm quite a political animal and have been all my life. It took me a while to learn quite a lot of the steps before I got into politics. But once I was in politics, it didn't take me very long at all to work out that I didn't have any power there, or that the people didn't have power within this current democracy. And to give you an example of that, only 2% of people are members of political parties. Not just in the UK, we're talking about the whole of Europe and in the US as well. So in this Western democracy with a political party system, only 2% of people are signing up for that. That doesn't mean people are not political, it doesn't mean they don't have parties that they belong to or preferences, clearly they do. But they're not invested in that, and they only get to vote once every 4 to 5 years. So where is my agency as a citizen, right? And so this is something I've been thinking about for most of my adult life, but it really came to a head specifically on the day that Jo Cox was murdered. I don't know how many of you remember that day, but it was a week before the Brexit referendum, and it just, in a sense, really encapsulated the whole, not just powerlessness, but the violence and the ongoing violence of the political system that pits people against each other rather than brings them together. So when you think about the crises that we have to face, if you were writing a Hollywood movie, you'd be saying, facing this crisis, the people came together and overcame it, right? That's the story that we would imagine is possible, but it's just not possible, because the only route that we have to making decisions is within a system in which half the country is invested in the failure of the other half. Why are we surprised that we haven't been able to really move forward in meeting the crisis? Even if all of us want to do that, there's no way for us to do that, right? And so for a time, I was trying to become a politician or trying to, change it from the inside. But I knew on that day that Jo Cox was murdered that there was no doing that. And I just jumped ship and founded this political platform called The Alternative. And for 4 years, we've just been exploring the question, if politics is broken, what's the alternative? And you know what? You may think there are many alternatives. But to actually create a new or a genuine alternative to this kind of offer to people is not a question of starting a new party. If you start a new party, you get swallowed into that system. Think about what happened to the Green Party. They've been around for 12, 15 years. They've sort of only got 1 seat in Parliament, even though 84% of the people want the government to give us real clear climate instructions. The Green Party's got 1 seat, right? So when you really work out that it's that messed up, you need a new system, not a new party. And that's kind of what I've been working on for the last 4.5 years. And it is to do with all the stuff we're talking about here, which is how do we create a way for people to find each other, in their communities, place-based communities, have access to the solutions that are already available, show their preference for that, really become active in these places, develop a new demand from it, but not just demanding on this political party system. The demand has got to be a demand on all of us that we start to do things differently and become the solution ourselves. So, this is not a question really about, the question of reclaim is not necessarily a question for me to describe a new political system, other than to say we're in the process of reclaiming our agency. Every human being can be part of what we call a cosmo-local community agency network, CANS for short. They're arising everywhere. It's not something we started, it's just that they've been arising for the last 10, 15 years. You're thinking about transition towns, eco-villages, every time there's a crisis, some new citizens thing springs up. The problem is they're not connected to each other. So our job now is connecting these all to each other. It's partly a technological problem, but mostly it's awakening the possibility issue right now that people sense. They can hear the news. This is an alternative. So right in the middle of all of this stramash, of possibilities, I have been asking myself, why am I this person? How did I come to be trying to work in this way all my life? What makes me specifically that? And my story is really that when I was very young, I was 11 years old, my brother was in a car crash, and I spent the night, when we heard the news that he was in this car crash, he was in another country, I spent the night really bargaining and pleading and remonstrating with God. In a sort of, if you do this, then I will do that. And this is in the body of an 11-year-old, it was you couldn't be more pleading, in a sense, for this outcome. And sadly, I wasn't heard. My brother died, and that was the beginning of a long journey facing death for me throughout my life. But mostly it was this commitment after that night that I wasn't going to ask anyone else anymore to sort or to deliver on my behalf. Now it was, what am I going to do with my life? How do I create value? How do I reconnect with my brother, despite the fact that he's been taken away? So that's really what set me on that journey, and I've been on that journey all my life. But this sense of now that we're living in an era of people waking up to how much they've been manipulated, forced to live lives that are not only good for the planet, they're not good for themselves, they're not good for their communities. We're living kind of wrong lives. And how can we take that back now and reinvent the present and the future? Yeah, that's my reclaiming way of life.
Thank you, Indra. Powerful story. Sam, can you share something that you've reclaimed?
Indeed. So I think I've approached my journey in life on a sense of cultural reclamation, not just cultural, but also relationship with heritage, senses of ancestry, and particularly our relationship within that to the natural world. And although I don't use it enough, perhaps, the word reclamation is kind of deep in me, this sense of seeking out the unwanted, the ignored, and often the treasure that's on our own doorsteps, as a place to divert attention to, as a source of inspiration, of reconnection. And I've done that on a few levels, and it was never very knowingly that was my ambition. I come from a background as a child growing up, very luckily finding nature as my companion and my close friend. And from that, found myself into folk song, which is in many ways, in this country, in our indigenous narrative tradition, is exactly the same as it is in all cultures and tribal devotional music that is there in service to a relationship with higher being, the land, in a very beautiful, reciprocal nature. And our folk song tradition, which goes back thousands of years in Great Britain, was something that had fallen into disrepair and into a very strange role that it played within our British sense of identity and society, and entered into a kind of music industry sort of way. And my journey into folk song went in very much into the field, into finding the people who still sang songs within the oral tradition. And although that concept of the old singers, the source singers, the keepers of old law and wisdom, they were considered to be dead and gone of another generation of the past, and all that material, that repertoire was on in libraries, on manuscripts, in wax cylinders or tape machines and reel-to-reels. I was very kind of defying of that, and went and discovered an incredible repertoire and community of singers within the gypsy and traveller communities. Obviously, the people who in this country were considered the most unwanted kind of social pariahs and treated with a sense of acceptable racism within this country, yet they were the custodians of some of our oldest, most intact, intangible heritage. So I spent 15 years meeting, recording, documenting, but also being in a process of transmission with some extraordinary elders, many of whom sadly have now passed on, some of whom are still alive, just learning those songs that in so many ways were songs that spoke of explicitly, or very often implicitly, about an older way of being in relationship with the natural world, and a sort of British, Irish, Anglo devotion to nature. And I really identified with that. And for me, part of that, finding that repertoire and connecting in with it, learning it, put me into a process of curatorship, of how could I amplify these voices and the songs themselves in a way that drew attention both to what we as a society have ignored, thrown out, said we don't want to have on our doorstep in our country, pretty much, and behaved with extraordinary behaviour towards. And so I went in that route as a singer to sing from those voices and not be a spokesperson for, but be somebody who could, bring attention to that. And as that work has gone on, actually what I've realized is that that connects very deeply and similarly with our relationship to the natural world, and going back to what we've all been saying about our disregard for our land, the privatization, the ownership of our land, which is such an unhealthy sense of accountability. And the outcome of that is we have one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world, with one of the highest rates of deforestation and lowest tree cover in Europe, alongside Ireland, and a species collapse. And so I've moved now into how the folk song can be an agency for connecting with nature through projects that I do within nature connection work, working particularly with endangered birds like the nightingale and the turtle dove, and finding new forms of brokering introductions for people to have experiences in the dark, at night, very often, in times where those boundaries, those sense of permissions, the sense of ownership, those fences cease to exist, where we go into a domain where actually we are visitors into a nature's domain. So trying to remove that sense of ownership, which is so prevalent within folk music because it's a commons, it's a repertoire that is owned by the people. Nobody owns a folk song, we're simply carriers of, we look after it for the next generation. So that sense of custodianship, which is built into the music, I'm very keen to how that can be translated over into a custodianship of the rare, the endangered, the disappearing, the fragile, but also the vital and the necessary within our natural heritage.
Thank you, and I'm just reminded of how I came to hear the nightingales with you this summer, that because of the coldness of the start to the summer, they weren't around.
No, yeah, well, incredibly, the nightingales are pretty resilient beings, but -3 degrees is not the temperature that should be existing in April. So alas, they are being subject to climatic changes as you and I felt that night too.
Yeah. Luckily we had a fire. There feels like there's some themes that have arisen in what everyone's been sharing around agency, around climate, around the ways in which we learn and the ways in which we are as humans, you know, and Paul, what you said about this thing of it actually just being very unnatural to sit and listen. And, you know, I feel like probably not here, but for most people that's also how you work as an adult, that your life is very sedentary. And actually, I would say that I spend a huge amount of time on a computer sitting down. And it's something that, you know, I know how unnatural that is, and I know how different I feel when it's not like that. And yet that's still the way that we're living. So there's some natural themes that have arisen around what needs reclaiming, but I would love for us to explore that a little bit deeper and find out what's really alive for you in this moment around what needs reclaiming the most, and what a radical reclamation could feel like.
One of the things that comes to mind, though, is having experienced some of Sam's music and the way that connects you with nature, how natural that feels and how normal, and how it's something that I think once you've experienced only once, you then think, you know, it's something that everyone needs and everyone else should have. And I think it's, once people experience these things, actually, it opens their eyes. And it isn't the hardest of sells, but one of the big problems for me at the moment is that sense of inertia and apathy because of the current system. That there's this sense, I think maybe politically as well, I kind of know this from my own local community as well, this sense that we just can't change it, and that feels so fixed, that one of the biggest challenges to overcome is actually to expose people to the idea that the alternative is possible. And I don't know if that's through sort of showing examples of actually where it is working and helping to promote those, that then you move things forward.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say in response to that, but I would say music and arts in general are going to play a huge part in that, because when people even think about trying to change something, they start to think strategy, and they start to think, you know, power blocks, and it's hard to recognize how much our ways of being, you know, are going to make a difference. You know, so we call it the onto shift, which is you know, because it's the ontological shift that has to happen. In other words, you know, you have to imagine that you're going to feel about your life very differently every day, every hour, rather than the way most of us feel, that we're basically on a hamster wheel. We don't have any time. We always have too much stress and too many problems to deal with. And, you know, we're not living a life, in fact. So reclaiming time becomes one of the most important things. And then within that time, you have to have the possibility of experiencing things you weren't experiencing before. So, you know, not even having time to feel healthy, or to listen to music, or to, you know, be part of something is one of the big obstacles. But I just want to draw attention to what I love about this word reclaim is that it's not saying the new, right? The new is really the old. You know, it's coming back to ourselves in so many ways. And the biggest part of this, to me, and it's a media thing as much as anything else, is how we've managed to think of ourselves as what I call homo economicus, as if we're just people who have material and physical needs, and we need money to match those things. Whereas actually in reality we are, you know, complex biopsychosocial spiritual entities that have, you know, that have very explicit emotional needs that need to get met all the time. And the only way at the moment they're getting met is by consumerism, right? So if you need belonging, or if you need status, and if you need, you know, autonomy, all of these things are really met by Nike, or Gucci or, you know, or some form of label that convinces you you're getting your needs met by buying something. And we're just trapped, we're so trapped. And the extent to which we're trapped, sometimes I think about it, it's just, it makes me, it's more than cringe, it makes me cry, you know, to think that we're not able to be fully human in our daily life. And if we were, we would be responding to these crises. We're in a trance all the time.
It reminds me of something that I saw this morning, a meme, and memes are so good at just sort of getting right to the heart of what we're experiencing, and it had the 7 deadly sins, each next to a particular app, and so lust was Tinder, sloth, Netflix, and so on, pride, LinkedIn, and it had all 7 of them, and greed, Amazon. I've given you almost all of them, but not all of them. It's so annoying. but it really just, it was one of those things where you're like, oh, yes, we have all been pulled into these sins, and actually what would happen if we were able to let those go and reclaim our own agency and our own being.
Or what if we could keep them, but reform their ways, and so that actually each one of them is in service to a better practice, better planet, that they're all not going to disappear. We ain't deleting Tinder. We ain't deleting people who don't stop using Amazon. But how, you know, how can we start to use them as tools for positivity? I guess is the
How could they be reclaimed into public services rather than like corporate extractions?
Isn't one of the biggest problems, though, that the system of governance means that it's just not equipped to deal with that? So we are on our back foot and trying to make up for this, but the reality is that that's always going to fail.
Absolutely. I mean, if we could spend the next, well, in fact, I'm seeing the next 30 years wasted if I'm trying to fix the old system. I don't think you can fix the old system. I think you have to build the new one that makes the old one obsolete. And sometimes you need to come out of the old system in a very, very determined way. It's hard, you know, but it's like coming off drugs, literally. And the media part of that is the worst and the most difficult to get out of, because it's the whole story. You know, we think we're powerless because that's how we're portrayed. You know, you actually have to reinvent yourself. But you start by reclaiming yourself, exactly as you were describing. You know, I love your story because it's just a true story, but it's available to all of us. And then we're actually trying to build a new media system, funnily enough, and it's not something we'll do by ourselves. It's something that is already emerging amongst a lot of people. But there has to be somewhere else to go, you know, to find the news, to find the truth, to find the solutions, because it's massively more than what you're reading every day, which is just terrible reflection, the meanest reflection of us, of our potential as a human race.
I want to come back to you, Anita, but I'll just share the list because I know how some brains work, but if you don't have all the list, it'll keep you up tonight. So they've got Uber Eats as gluttony, wrath is Facebook, envy Instagram. And it's interesting as well because something that has come up is that the way that social media have been editing their controls is that anything that's to do with activism is now seen as a political thing. And if you want to do any adverts around events and things like Change Festival, to bring people together to talk about themes like reclamation, you have to send in passports and all kinds of things to get affiliated to be a political organization through Facebook. And Advaya, which is an incredible organization that hosts talks and courses, have recently just had their Instagram deleted with no warning, and they've been spending quite a long time getting lots of people to log complaints, and so far it's not coming back. And so there's also a lot of control happening, And so there's a long way to go to reclaiming these platforms, reclaiming these ways in a way where they really can be expressions of public good. And then it also brings about an interesting question, because everybody wants to have the freedom to express, and some people's expressions are more inclusive, and some people's expressions are very much against someone else, and so that line is very is a treacherous one, and so some of these rules may have come in to protect from hate crimes or something, but then they might be landing in a different way, and we don't really know where the motivation is, because we don't know what the algorithms are saying. Anita, what do you feel is most alive around reclaiming, and what would a radical reclamation in your lifetime look like?
I mean, I think I'd agree with everyone else on reclaiming the individual self. I don't think that without reclaiming the individual self, we can actually have the collective movement that we kind of idolize, or like looking at this collective movement of the people uprising and creating this new system. I don't think that can happen without actually reclaiming the individual self, because I think a lot of people are lost in the media, in the internet, in this type of consumerism world and this material-based type of motivations, that they haven't actually looked at what they want as a person and who they are as a person, looking back at their heritage or looking back at the things that actually matter in their lives, to actually think, well, maybe this is what's important to me, rather than the social media likes or the latest designer purse. And I think because of this, and because we don't have this kind of reclamation of our individual self, we can't actually make this collective movement that we kind of want or talk about all the time, because people aren't actively there yet. They've not quite reached that point where they're ready to join a movement. Right now, they're trying to kind of find out what's best for them, but because their priorities are aligned towards material things, they're not going in the direction which we may hope for. And I think when looking at radical kind of reclamation, I think in my lifetime, it'd be looking at my generation, the younger generations, and how they move towards this kind of collective conscious. I think we've seen loads of reports about Gen Z being more eco-conscious when buying things, or like moving to thrifting. And I think these are important things, like as a starting point, but seeing how that goes and seeing how they can actually be supported to ensure that they really do go ahead and change systems. Like everyone, when they're younger, kind of has this view that they want to change the world. It's making sure we keep that view as they grow older, so they can actually go into like different organizations or different like workspaces that allow them to change the world in the way they kind of wish to. And I think it's really important looking back at education, how we kind of radicalize education, because being taught from a textbook to teach an exam clearly doesn't give young people the platform they need to change the world, or even kind of start looking at those discussions around how they view themselves in order to become a collective. And I think if we had a bigger focus on that in schools, starting from like high school and moving into sixth form and colleges, I think we'd really see that our future generations would have a much more greater understanding of themselves, reclaiming themselves, which will allow them to kind of bring about this collective, which I think is what we want to see in terms of making a new alternative.
Thank you. Sam, Paul said earlier, everybody needs to hear you sing. He did say that.
Yeah, but the subtext was, but not on Sunday mornings.
I didn't hear that bit. Is there something that you feel that you can offer, just put you on the spot completely?
Yeah. Can I say something a little bit? Because I think I want to follow on from what you said, Anita, and it connects in with what Paul was saying, just something I feel that's becoming very strong at the moment. And we were talking earlier about friends of ours, Guy Shrubsole and Nick Hayes, writers of Book of Trespass and Who Owns England, who are fighting a very, very massive battle, and that's about accessibility and relationship to the land, that's going to become bigger and bigger and bigger, and feels very pertinent right now with the police bill coming through and the criminalising of trespass, which feels a very knowing move on the government's behalf, knowing what accessibility to land and ownership to land, particularly British soil, is going to mean in the decades ahead of climate change. And I think one of the most radical things that we can be doing right now is teaching the youth and all the youth about what land means and how to honour it, how to be close to it, how to respect it, how we depend upon it, because I think this is something that's going to become more and more vital as time comes about what access to land means, what a privilege that is. And, you know, knowing what's going on in Chettle at the moment as a sort of, you know, pioneering vision of that about, you know, sustainability and what's happening brilliantly in this country in terms of nature reclamation, but also the growers who are starting to look at more robust systems of food growing, sustainability with that, is really inspiring, and seeing so much more of the youth entering into that as a potential, as a future journey. I feel in many ways the thing that I wish I could spend more time was learning how to grow. I think it's the greatest skill we can inherit to our children right now, and there's nothing embarrassing or I don't know what the word is. There's nothing about that as a sort of ambition that is in any way not massive and brilliant. And and I sort of feel like I should lay down all my other jobs and, you know, just start taking to the plough, but no, a no-till form of ploughing. And there is a song, there are many songs. Songs carry all of this, all those stories and those relationships and histories. And I'm just trying to think of the one, and maybe I'm going to sing this one, which I had the great honour, great honour of singing this to the Senator John Kerry only about a week and a half ago by reasons I can't quite understand or believe, but happened to be with him in a pub in London and sang this, which was about the destruction of land. It's actually in Northern Ireland, but by the English on Northern Irish soil, and the cutting down of trees of an ancient woodland. And it's such a powerful, small song that speaks both about the lament of the community, but also the lament of the birds who lose their home to this wanton act of claiming, not reclaiming, but claiming of that ancient oakland. So this is Bonnie Portmore, which is the name of the giant ancient oak at the centre of this woodland. And I'll give it my best shot, unwarmed up. Here goes. Oh, Bonnie Portmore, I am sorry for to see the woeful destruction of your ornament tree. You've stood on these shores for many's a long day, till the long boat of Antrim came to float you away. Oh, Bonnie Portmore, you shine where you stand, and the more I think on you, the more I think long. For if I had you now, as I had you before, then the lords of old England could not purchase Portmore. For the birds in the forest so bitterly weep, crying, where can we shelter And where can we sleep? The oak and the ash, they have all been cut down, and the trees of bonny Portmore are all fell to the ground. Oh, bonny Portmore, I'm sorry for to see the woeful destruction of your ornament tree.
That's Sam Lee unwarmed up on a Sunday morning whilst on tour performing every night and also in and out of COP. Thank you, Sam. You mentioned chettle, and a lot of people won't understand the reference. So I wonder if someone from Chettle wants to explain what it is, as we have various people from this village in Dorset. Would anyone like to? I could do it, but I feel like if one of you gives us a few sentences around what Chettle is, just so that there's a bit more context.
Come on, Becky.
So welcoming now Becky Birchall, who is the producer and curator of Change Festival. And you're going to have to speak into both of these mics.
Thank you, and thank you for the lovely song, Sam. That was beautiful. So Chettle, yes, Chettle is where I live. It is a village in Dorset. It has 100 people, and there's about 900 acres of land. And there is one owner of the village, which is Alice, who's here today. The reason it's unusual is because it is one of the only villages that's still in one ownership with all the land as well, which is, strangely feudal in these times and in many ways problematic. But the really exciting opportunity that we've got in Chettle is that because there is a land and houses and people that are all part of one community, it suddenly gives an opportunity to really reimagine what a community and what a community that has land could do together. So at the moment, we're going through quite a big visioning process to sort of think about, okay, we've got this kind of canvas, so what does that look like? What happens? So we've been thinking about the future of that land, thinking about, what could be reclaimed from the sort of agricultural industrial system of farming that has been prevalent in those fields for many years, thinking about how we can think about that in 50 years' time. Where will the trees grow back again? How will we farm differently? What animals will we bring back that are currently not there? And really crucially, how will the village play a part in that? So for many years, the farmers have been farming and the villagers have just been living separately. So now we're thinking about how do we integrate those things again? How do we create more places for people that work on the land to live? How do we bring people that already live in the village back onto the land again? So yeah, it's kind of, we're at the start of a really exciting journey, and all of the people that we've had at Change Festival, many of you are now sort of being brought into conversations about a real life project that is kind of reclaiming what local communities should be and what they could be. And so yeah, it's really exciting. Obviously, I appreciate it's a very unusual situation, and most people don't have the opportunity to kind of, decide what happens on the fields or decide what happens in the village. But what we're hoping is that by doing it in Chettle, we'll have an opportunity to really try some stuff out and look at how the community themselves can make those decisions and be really part of it. So one of the first projects we're setting up, which will be community owned, which we've just set up, is a new food hub, which is our own community farm and a shop and a cafe, which we're just at the start of fundraising for, and that will be all community owned. So we're hoping that once we've got that up and running and we've got that model, there'll be opportunities for more community ownership moving forward. So yes, watch this space.
Thank you, Becky. And It's important to point out, especially for our more international listeners, that what Alice has done here is radical, and she's a really beautiful example of what leadership can look like, because that's not the case for most people that happen to own estates and villages in the UK. And with that, I'm curious to talk a little bit more about the trespassing law and the implications of that. And I guess that means that people that are just going for walks with their dogs, and perhaps more especially people of colour, might find themselves getting into trouble for doing something just very like unmeaning and undamaging.
Paul, do you want to answer this or anyone else?
No, yeah, it's quite, in the countryside and rural environment is not the most welcoming place for certain groups within society. But I think also people are quite unaware, actually, though, more broadly, everyone in society is quite limited in that we often see a landscape and you think, oh, this is beautiful, and it sort of implicitly we think, oh, we can, anyone can access this, but the reality is that there's far greater lines and barriers that exist within this landscape. And that if you were someone who actually wanted to stray off the path slightly and go and explore somewhere slightly less sort of managed and regimented, you would probably find yourself trespassing. What's interesting, and what Sam was saying as well, is with the new bill, the proposals of how then that criminalises that behaviour, and that it would control the ability for people to organise and to gather in those sorts of landscapes as well, and then the impact of that on the ability to then protest and I don't know, Sam, do you think so?
Yeah, I think I'd like to just take it a step further as well, because in a way the land movement is the one that I can understand the best. And there are land reclaiming land, movements all over the country, especially in Scotland, I think, where they've actually begun to get some traction with the government. The government's actually beginning to think, can we do something to support this movement? But when you think about community wealth at all, like you living in a place, a town or a city or a village, and none of the wealth in that place belongs to the citizens. It's really astounding. If you were to occupy an empty building that in theory belongs to your community where you live, you wouldn't be given the right to develop that building, because somebody from another part of the world wants to use that building to build something for themselves, and the money gets siphoned off outside of that place. So all of these empty buildings are now being bought by property developers that simply want to make money for themselves, and that money is going away from your community. So literally, we are, even now in this modern day and age, being constantly, I don't even want to use the word, we're being taken all the time, every day, and waking up. The land movement, I think, is the most effective way for people to relate. Like, I literally can't walk on this land. But the wealth that my community generates, that owns, none of it belongs to me, the community, at all. And waking up to that. And in these new community groups that are growing, this concept of community wealth building is just reclaiming the wealth that is yours for your community. That is the whole principle of it. And it would include, these empty buildings, but also, huge companies coming to living in your space, taking up your all your energy and food that's in that space, and then, commissioning people outside of that community to do all the work for that building. It's incredible how much we are constantly being, there's a worse word for it, right? But we're being taken all the time. What's ours is just taken away from us all the time.
Do we underestimate that process of land enclosure and the legacy of that? Very much also underpinning that development of capitalism, because then that's the relationship between material belongings, moving outside of land, But yeah, there's so much power in that sense that I think if sharing the commons, is it the phrase is public luxury rather than private sufficiency? You know, shifting that relationship so that actually the public shares the ownership. And I think so many of the relationships then develop from that, and you can use that as a catalyst in order to develop some of these other things that are less tangible.
I mean, I'll just chip in a little bit and say that, yeah, in the history of disenfranchisement in this country, from enclosure acts onwards. I mean, not that it began there, but this is quite a terrifying step into authoritarianism, greater than I think people really appreciate, because we've got to this point where we've sort of been so sort of societally disconnected, but actually at the moment it's just a civil disobedience to step off the public footpath, and for those who've actually got that far to even get on that because they have the transport to get to somewhere nice. The moving into that, it's not in the domain of the landowner to prosecute or act upon a trespasser. It's now in the hands of the police and the government. So it doesn't have to have the landowner's sort of motivation to prosecute. Is deeply terrifying. As somebody who is an ardent trespasser, has been all my life, can't see a fence without wanting to jump over it. Always with great respect to the crop, to the livestock or whatever, or to the ecology of that place. I'm terrified at what this will do for a greater sense of, for me on an ecological level, on this idea that actually if we are not as a society being more outdoors, being more land appreciative, and I'm not talking here about spades and growing and stuff, I'm talking just about children and families and young people who are having beautiful experiences in relationship with nature, just that sense of joy and playfulness in that domain. If we're not, if that's not now possible, or the numbers of people who are doing it is shrinking and shrinking through fear and disconnection, actually the biodiversity and the species here will be lost because there's nobody there to defend them, because everybody's forgotten what a turtle dove sounds like, what a curlew sounds like. Nobody's there to protect these beings. And biodiversity is the most important thing really on the planet. That's what we're depending on. Our biodiversity in the UK is absolutely vital, because what we're losing is our invertebrates and our diversity in plants, and we need that to have safe and sustainable harvests. That's a very small thing. So we need people out there in relationship, otherwise there's no one going to protect or defend all the shifts that are trying to be made towards industrialization and extractive and exploitative harvesting, growing, and that sort of thing. So that's why I think this is a dangerous move, if that's not a simplification.
Is there a more positive side though in terms of rivers? During lockdown, lots of people went and bought paddle boards and were out exploring rivers. Was it something like only 4% of rivers there were public access? Yeah. But now we've had programs exploring sewage companies, all the waste that's been going into them, that now is starting to reach the public consciousness. Is that going to be the start of something that then starts to change more broadly our relationship with the rest of nature?
Yeah, I mean, Guy Shobsall made a really good point during lockdown when the beaches were packed. Why isn't that the case in the rest of Europe? And it's because the Europeans have a village by village relationship with the river, that when it's hot and it's the middle of summer, all the families go to the river and swim. We don't go near rivers. So we have a lot of coastline as well, but everyone runs to the sea. But actually, what a wonderful resource that is. And yeah, there's a big backlash in the government when they didn't pass through the pollution bill, which was unbelievable that they voted against that. Just unbelievable. And it's obviously purely because of finance. And that those companies have got their their strings, the politicians, firmly tied up. But there was a backlash to that, and there's been a certain amount of recapitulating, a certain amount of accountability. But yeah, rivers is a great place to start, and it's a great place for people to start in their sense of sort of place to go, spend a nice summer's day.
Absolutely. Having spent the year in Devon, and there is a culture around the River Dart,
Yeah.
but all the local swimmers will say, don't put your head under because of the sewage, and those that have put their head under often will have a cold, like be unwell for a bit afterwards, and so it's all hand in hand, isn't it? Like, yeah, what needs reclaiming?
Yeah, River Dart, every year you claim a heart, as the old poem goes.
Beautiful. Anita, what's fizzing for you?
I mean,
this?
Coming back to the policing bill, I think not only is it a threat to how we view our relationship with nature, but also a threat to our democracy. I think it's important to note when we look at throughout the years of disenfranchisement, looking at the Peterloo Massacre or the suffragette movement and how the right to protest and protest have really kind of shaped how we have gained our democracy in the UK. And I think, especially for youth movements, a lot of our kind of biggest way of kind of holding government accountable is strikes. I mean, our local youth strike group got Youth Strike Manchester, and I think having this type of big policing bill that has most of our strikes rendered illegal, technically, it's a really big threat to how young people actually participate in their type of youth groups or the movement of the climate movement, because a lot of young people are signing the petitions, but they don't feel like that's doing anything. I think strikes actually give young people a sense of power in the fact that they're being able to kind of hold government accountable in a different way, in a way that they can actually be heard or seen. And I think this type of bill kind of alienates young people from the conversation because they're not alienated enough. But I think by having this bill, it kind of makes sure that young people really aren't heard, because strikes are one of the biggest ways we see young people are heard in terms of the climate movement. So I think when we're looking at this bill, this policing bill, and whether it should go through, not only is it an attack on how we view our relationship with nature, but also an attack on how we actually voice and hold our government accountable, which I think, for me, is the most enraging part of the bill.
There's so many gaps to fill out there. I feel that even in this room we're talking about like 6 or 7 different forms of agency, right? And you know, because we're living in this virtual world, and we're all able. You know, this is the era of the non-state actor, right? We can all see on the internet what we could be doing, but there's not a lot of joining up of the dots. You know, that would help things to really come together. And there's just 2 things that I was thinking about as you were talking there, Anita, about when I hear Fridays for Future, or I hear Greta talking about the demands, and then I also hear a lot of older people talking about the young people, right? The young people are going to do, but there's a gap, isn't there, between what if the young people were suddenly in charge? They'd certainly, that move into action, or make the difficult decisions. But then what would happen next? You know, how do we actually recreate this system? You know, what is the new education? There's a lot of work to be done in the next 3-4 years about really trying to bring to the surface. I mean, for example, when I was listening to you talking about a new education system, it reminded me of this Japanese, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, Tsunasaburo Makiguchi. He was a 12th century education, reformer. And what he said was that kids should only go to school until midday, and then the second half of the day they should be out working in the community. Because until they're working in the community, they don't understand relationships. They don't understand how things get built or how people can live together and so on. So that's a whole different, there's a radical different approach to what learning actually is. Because I find myself that working in the internet, working in this virtual way most of the time is a bit like just working in this field of possibility. I call it coming down from the map onto the territory. Unless you're working on the territory, you don't know what you're building actually, or how to get something built. So there's this work to be done And the point of the cans, I think, is that you get a container, it's like an incubator. Exactly like this project that you're describing in Chapel. You know, it's going to be an incubator, isn't it, for all relationships, and using the technology, and using the whole global, you know, cosmolocal possibility. Without incubators, you're just not going to be able to really hone down on what do we need to do with our daily lives. And I love what you were saying about it's going to be cool to be farmers and it's going to be cool to be working with the hands. I think absolutely that's the way it's going to go. When people say, what can we do? And just finally, a very small example of that, we're working with a bunch of cans, a network of cans in South Africa. And over the COVID period, it went from this fantastic relationship between them when the more privileged were helping the less privileged. But there came a point where there was nothing else to do but to start to grow your own food, right? And the poorest started that first and did it in the most effective, and started to get results quite quickly. So suddenly, the least privileged community were teaching the most privileged community what they needed to know about when it really hits the fan, what we need to do. So I think that is the growth space, exactly as you were describing. You know, with the young people to actually get your hands dirty, to build something, gives the most incredible feeling. We're doing something now, as opposed to protest, which still leaves you frustrated. You know, that you've made your protest and now what happens? It could be 10 years before a real, yeah.
Can I ask a question to this?
Yeah.
How do we make that more sexy than Uber Eats and Instagram? More attractive?
You know, you've got it here. You know, it's like it's the young people actually doing it. You know, the day that Greta says, I had something extraordinary actually. Vandana Shiva said in an interview recently that when she met Greta for the first time, she said to her, "It's great that you're striking. Keep it to Fridays, because the other 6 days of the week, I want you to be working on the land." You know, and that's you know, the day that Greta says, I'm working on the land and building this thing in my community, it's just the more young people find that when you work out how gorgeous that is to be doing that with people, like growing your own stuff and making something happen and seeing a building actually grow. I mean, it's, you know, they're going to love it compared to sitting in front of a computer screen all the time.
And seeing a vegetable.
Yeah.
It's an amazing thing. If you didn't grow up seeing vegetables, and you're like, wow, it's just coming out from the ground.
With that little seed, you know? Yeah.
From a school's perspective, though, it's interesting because so many schools are still selling this narrative of the jobs of the future as being digital and pushing children to do maths and science and to go to university and to work, you know, on a very digital sense. And we're not yet seeing a backlash. We're not yet seeing this response of actually pushing an alternative message saying, no, the jobs of the future are those that are conserving, looking after nature and engaging with the real world in a really time. And we've got things like, you know, Facebook being renamed Meta, you know, and thinking this sort of dystopian idea of the future as being really virtual and disconnected from the real world. And I think, you know, that idea of actually giving young people the opportunity to, like you say, see vegetables grow and to experience that firsthand is so important within the educational system. But the other thing that was just coming to mind with what was being said as well is, I think more broadly with society, but also in education, the way that we look back on direct action and the role that direct action has played within our own history is really odd. You know, within the educational system, we sort of look back on suffrage and, you know, all these other stories with a great sense that they were important and they did something good, but then also, you know, at the time they were seen as a nuisance, and that's definitely what we're experiencing with lots of the environmental movement now, is more broadly society think that they're wasting their time, but actually if we were to put them in the story of the past and actually what has changed society, it has been direct action like this. So I think young people are getting this mixed message where they are maybe not being encouraged to protest, but they see that as an opportunity to, and then they don't see that actually the parallels with past events as well. I don't know.
The new media system.
But I don't know how that story sits with you, and have you ever looked back on the past and direct action and seen actually how that has had positive outcomes, and so maybe it does have a role now.
So obviously I take A levels, and one of my A levels are politics. So there's like a whole section on the franchise, direct action, how different groups in society kind of got their right to vote through direct action. And I think that resonates with me when I look at the environmental movement and how we see young people striking. And although we see in the media they're labeled as nuisance, they should be back in school, whatever, this, that, and the other, I think it's not as disheartening as it should be for maybe some to me, because it's something I expect. When we look at the time of when we see the suffrage movement or when we see the Peterloo Massacre and how they were written about in their time, they were written about in a really similar manner, in the same kind of type of view that they were a nuisance or that they weren't useful or that type of thing. And I think when I see that again about the environmental movement, I just think, well, it's just history repeating itself in a way. Regardless of how much we say by learning history, we make sure we don't repeat it. I think we do repeat it multiple times, regardless of whether we're aware of it or not. And I think that's why I don't get as, like, recently, not our last protest, the protest beforehand, we had a really negative article written by someone who had attended the Manchester protest, and how they kind of said all these things, there's like listed like 10 things wrong with young people leading protests in Manchester. And I was like, okay. And I think a lot of the group are really disheartened about this. And I was like, well, it is really mean what he said. But at the same time, we expect this. This is the type of backlash we have gotten, Fridays for Future in general, international has gotten from a lot of type of critics. And I think young people have kind of learned to take that on the shoulder and kind of, oh, this is what comes of it. And I think it's important that when we look at this, we don't look at the criticisms now, but look at how we can help the generations that are going to come after us, and how our work isn't just strikes. We do actually hold government account in different ways. We speak to our local politicians. We try to get involved. We have In Our Nature in Manchester, and they're really cool, helping secondary school kids and college and sixth form kids like get involved in growing their own food and like using the garden spaces they have. And I think that's really important in how we kind of reframe what climate activism looks like. It's not always protests. It's not always people at the front screaming. It's also looking at how we make our lives more eco-friendly. It's how we make sure that young people are aware of the disaster that is the climate crisis, but also that they understand they do have a part to play in it, even if it's not striking at the forefront. So I think that's really important when we look at what people think about climate activism, especially from young people. I think there's a very narrow-minded view on how young people participate in climate activism portrayed by the media, and I think that's important that we kind of change the narrative.
I'm afraid we don't have time for questions from everyone here, as we've been just trying to close a few of these loops that are open here. In terms of a vision of radical reclamation, it feels like a vision of a beautiful future is one where all landowners of the UK go to Alice and Chettle to see what has been happening there, and to actually, to have the courage to take a step to do something really radical, and let go of that sense of owning. And I feel the call to mention Lady Godiva as we're here in Coventry and her naked ride through Coventry for tax reform that Satish Kumar was reminding us of when we arrived in Coventry at the beginning of Change Festival. And with that imagery that's just been planted in the room, I would love to invite each of you to share how we can rise up to reclaim a call to action. And after you have shared your call to action, to share how we can contact you to carry on and deepen the conversation. So any relevant website, social media, that kind of thing. Paul?
I think for me, there's a general sense of just always being questioning, so always being critical, never accepting the status quo. And I think that's what I'm trying to do in terms of education in young people, so that they actually ask questions of what's going on around them and their role within the rest of society. But I think that's something that we can all do, is just be more critical actors within the system that we exist, and that will only ever bring around good change. In terms of contacting me, I guess I have a website. Geography Pool is the website. So Geography Pool. So yeah.
.com.
I think probably if you search, you'll find.
Indra.
Yeah, thank you. It's kind of really what happened just in this room, I feel, so, the call to rise up would be to sort of take your attention away from the mainstream media and what the mainstream media is telling you is happening, and actively search for the real evidence that you're going to find if you start to look around the place where you live of people doing things in a different way, and then really try to join up with that to create more, what I call cosmolocal community agency networks, from the place where you are. And I would say that tech actually is very important for that, to keep it cosmolocal as opposed to, otherwise you might fall into the trap of thinking this is too small and it doesn't have any real, impact. It really does when it's cosmolocal. So that's my call to action. And you'd find all of this stuff on thealternative.org.uk. And you can join up and become part of the conversation and be the new news.
Anita.
I think in terms of radical change, I think changing how we view the climate crisis, making sure it's personal to ourselves in order to kind of really build on that collective action. I think that's my biggest thing. Making sure we are given platforms like this platform to speak, making sure young people are part of the discussions, the Global South, Indigenous people, people of colour, making sure that these groups that are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis are here to speak at the table. I think that's the biggest thing, because I don't think we're going to get any really intersectional climate solutions when we don't have those voices heard, and if we don't have our kind of individual self kind of known. So that's probably my biggest thing. And no, I'm not fancy enough to have a website, but you can contact me on my email, anitaokunde1@gmail.com, or just my Instagram, anitaokunde.
Thank you. Sam?
I'm not going to rattle off the millions of things that we citizens can do, because there's so many ways that we could be better humans, and I think to not punish ourselves for not always being perfect. But I will say, and very much this came through with the Fridays for Future movement and my time being at the youth marches, where I've never felt older, which is a very good thing. And they have been the greatest moments of hope that I felt within this movement, this life, the life of campaigning that I've taken up. But I think the mantra that I stand by always, and within all the work that I do, and I think I saw this very in evidence, is to beat the opposition. You have to throw a better party. And if whatever way our lives are going to go, as long as we are together in celebration and shared praise and grief, and supporting each other, it's going to be a fight worth fighting. Yeah.
And how can we connect with you deeper?
Family Song is my handle. If you can handle me.
Are you ready for this jelly?
Oh God.
Thank you, Change Festival. Let's rise up to reclaim, and the one that feels most alive for me is really feeling, what can you reclaim in your life right now? And it can be your hair, just something that connects you deeper to your identity, to the truth of who you are, and to you as a more mythical being, and allows a new sense of what's possible in you, because it's through each of us connecting to that agency within us that we're going to be able to do something radical together. And you can contact me through thefutures.earth. Thank you.